Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The right to refuse unsafe work is one of the 3 basic health and safety rights achieved by the labour movement, along with the right to know about the hazards in your workplace and the right to participate in workplace health and safety decisions. And while procedures and circumstances may vary from province to province, just about all workers have the legal right to a healthy and safe workplace that allows, and in some provinces obligates them, to protect their own safety by refusing to perform work that they believe has the potential to harm themselves or others at the worksite. Mr. Speaker, all workers in Canada have the right to work in a safe and healthy environment. Over the last decade, the previous Conservative government has undone many of the progressive advances for workers that have been achieved over generations. Mr. Speaker, on February 19th, I asked the government why it has not tabled legislation to reverse some of the most egregious changes brought in by the Conservatives. And sadly, Mr. Speaker, I did not get my answer. On the health and safety front, the Conservatives used the Omnibus Bill C4 to change the Canadian Labour Code to limit the rights of workers to refuse unsafe work and also to do away with the independent health and safety officers, relegating their responsibilities to political appointees of the minister. The bill also made sweeping changes to the Public Service Labour Relations Act to prevent federal public service workers from filing complaints with the Canadian Human Rights Commission, and also gutted public service collective bargaining by allowing the government to unilaterally determine which workers are deemed essential and therefore forbidden from striking without recourse to a third-party review. During the debate about these changes, many individuals and organizations brought forward grave concerns. Larry Russo of the PSAC wrote that the changes, stuffed into a 309-page Budget Implementation Act, would turn the clock back 50 years for labour relations. But no voice, Mr. Speaker, was more compelling than that of Rob Ellis, whose 18-year-old son David was killed on the job. On David's second day of work at a temporary position in a bakery, he was pulled into an industrial mixer that was operating without a safety guard and lockout. David lacked the experience to comprehend the dangers of the workplace. This is what Rob Ellis, his dad, said. We should not assume new workers have enough experience to recognize or categorize the level of danger of every workplace condition. New or young employees should be encouraged to say no to unsafe work. And when they do stand up and say no, they should not be subject to discipline if their complaint is rejected without investigation. During the federal election, the Parliamentary Secretary's website promised that a Liberal government would, and I quote, repeal the Conservative definition of danger in the Canada Labour Code that is regressive and sacrifices the health and safety rights of workers. So why has the Minister remained silent? I simply ask the Minister, through the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, when will the government repeal these draconian measures? Thank you.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Labour.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to commend my colleague from Saskatoon West on her speech and, of course, her great interest in labor issues. And I'd like to share with the rest of the House as well, Mr. Speaker. I think we share a similar view on what transpired over the past 10 years, and certainly with the former Conservative government. And it was, you know, Canadians weren't fooled. They understood fully that it was organized labor that was under attack under the last government. And we saw that through many manifestations, through various pieces of legislation. We saw it in an unprecedented use of back-to-work legislation, and the legislation for Canada Post, for Air Canada, those things come to mind. It was like even before those organizations were in a strike position, those unions were in a position that they could go out on strike. There was back-to-work legislation coming off the shelf to be presented in the House, Mr. Speaker. So, we saw that. We saw the absolutely Bills 377 and 525 were directed at organized labor, and you know, the 377, we saw that, you know, the constitutional experts said it was unconstitutional. We saw privacy experts say that it compromised the privacy of millions of Canadians. We saw provinces and territories saying it impeded on an area of their purview. Constitutionally, you know, it was their area of responsibility. So, you know, that was what we saw. That was the table that was set in the last Parliament by the last government. And certainly what we've tried to do since October 19th and since the new minister had come in November 4th was set a different atmosphere around labor and our work with labor. And certainly with C4, the current C4, not the old conservative C4, but the first piece of legislation our minister had presented was to repeal 377 and 525 within C4. And so I myself was very happy that was the first piece of legislation that she tabled. But over the course of my experience over the last 4 years dealing with both employers and employees, one thing that has been consistent, one message that has been clear coming from both areas, is that any changes to the labor code has to be done through an all-party, a tripartite approach with labor, with employers, employees, stakeholders, the provinces and territories, everybody involved. And they said that clearly in 377. They said it in 525. We believe that the 2004 definition that was brought in by past Liberal governments is the right way to go. But that any change in the code has to be undertaken with a tripartite approach, and I hope you know that my colleague from Saskatoon West will understand that's the approach that this government will take in changing the labor code. It'll be under a tripartite approach.
Member for Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do want to thank my honourable colleague for his comments and for his government's leadership in those very early stepping out of the gate when becoming a new government and focusing on some very important legislation that for workers was important to get changed quickly. And I guess what I would say to some of his comments about the Canadian Labour Code, the changes that were made by the previous government were just changed unilaterally by the government. And what we're asking, particularly when it comes to workplace safety, is that we immediately go back and give over 800,000 workers that work in federally regulated industries, including the public service. They deserve the right to refuse unsafe work. They deserve the right to safeguard their health through a system of monitoring and enforcement by trained and neutral health and safety officers, and if necessary, a recourse to a tribunal staffed by independent decision makers. And they deserve the right to come home safely at the end of every work day. Mr. Speaker, I am asking the government to step up and step out sooner rather than later and make sure everyone comes home safe. Thank you.
Honourable Parliament Secretary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and again to my colleague and everybody else in the House. The government is pledging to keep Canadian workplaces, certainly in federal jurisdictions, safe, fair, and productive. You know, our intention is to work with all stakeholders, with employers, employees, organized labor, the provinces and territories, to make sure that that the Labour Code reflects today's workforce and reflects the necessity to be safe, fair, and productive. Let me be clear that we believe all Canadians should have and deserve the right to work in a safe workplace. Certainly, our intention is to work toward that. We believe that we're off to a pretty good start, Mr. Speaker, and we hope to continue on and to make sure that we do earn the confidence of Canadian workers, not just in federal jurisdictions, but all Canadian workers. Mr. Speaker, that's what we're committed to as a government, and that's what we'll do. Thank you.